Today I'm going to be talking about the dimensions of character. Now, you often hear people say that characters should be three-dimensional, which is kind of like looking at them in space as an object. They have to be well-rounded is what it means. But to make a character truly well-rounded, you don't need three dimensions, you need four. And so characters must have four dimensions in order to be completely believable. What are these four dimensions? Well, it's not time and space. The four dimensions are elements of their psyche, their psychology. And these four dimensions are motivation, methodology, evaluation, and purposes. I'm going to cover each one of these briefly so you can see what they are, and then you can understand why they're all essential, and if you're missing one, your character will not feel like a real person to your reader or audience. So let's begin with the one everybody knows, motivation. Like an actor would say, what's my motivation? And what they really mean is, why am I doing this? Why would I act that way? Often when we see a story where a character just doesn't seem to click, for some reason they're just acting in a way that you say, I wouldn't do that, nobody would do that, it's because we can't see a motivation for them acting that way. And unless you establish a reason, whether they had a rotten childhood or whether they are somebody who's learned to be mean, or like what's Scrooge's motivation for acting the way that he does in A Christmas Carol. You need to know why, or you can't understand actions that are taken that don't add up to somebody who is well balanced. Somebody who acts in a way that's not balanced, clearly there's got to be some reason for it. Motivation is really an inequity. It's what you're missing, what's out of balance, something that isn't quite ringing true. It's usually driven by looking into your life and saying, things right now are great, but they could be even better. Oh, I want that. I want it. I really, really want it. Well, suddenly you've got an imbalance and inequity between the way things are and the way they might be. Suddenly you have a motivation because that has created an inequity in you between what you'd like to have or the way you like things to be and the way they actually are. Now, it can also be that you say, things are really terrible and I just want it over, and so I better do something to achieve that. That's a negative kind of motivation. So motivation, just because it's an inequity, doesn't mean that it has to be a bad thing. It can be a bad thing or a good thing. And it doesn't have to look towards the future. It could look towards the past and say, oh, I used to be king of England and now I'm a slave. Okay, I want things back the way they were. There's a good negative motivation, is to get rid of this terrible thing I'm suffering from the past. Make it like it was. Or that I don't ever want it to go there because it used to be like that in the past and I want to keep things the way they are and I'll struggle and fight to keep them. It doesn't matter. That's your motivation. But usually motivations are not so much in the physical world. They come from something we don't even know, something we don't even remember. If you look at psychiatrists all the time will tell you you have to look back to whatever the inciting incident was that created that. They often call it a ghost or they call it baggage or something when you're talking about characters. That's true. Those things are there. But to make it clear, it has to be, what is this person's drive? Well, often you'll say, for example, what's the character's motivation? And they'll say, well, he wants to be president. Okay. Well, that's our second dimension, actually. Being president, wanting to be president, that is not a motivation, that's a purpose. That's when, driven by your inequity, you've said, here's something that I think will satisfy that need I have. And so one person might want to be president because they had no power as a child. Another might want to be president because they deplore the state of things in the country and would like them to change. You know, any number of different purposes might satisfy any given motivation. And similarly, for any given purpose, there may be any number of motivations that might drive people to try to achieve that particular thing. So in a story where there's a goal and a lot of people are after it, it may be for a lot of different reasons. And in other stories, you may have people all driven by the same thing, but they're all after different goals that they think will satisfy it based on their experience and personality. So we have two dimensions now. We have motivations, which are the underlying drives as to what that inequity is that leaves people feeling out of balance and unsatisfied until they get it. Even if they're eager and positive, they're still unsatisfied till they get it. And what they think will satisfy that. You don't just get there. You don't just snap your fingers and suddenly you've got your purpose. You got to work for it. You got to find a way to cross that chasm. You got to find a way to get from A to Z. And you do that with the third character dimension, methodology. Any number of kinds of methodologies can be used. Let's try being logical. No, let's go with our heart. Let us try to to build a business of our own is our methodology to achieve wealth. No, let us try to work our way up through the corporate structure. That's a way to achieve wealth, okay? Even if people share motivations and purposes, they may differ in terms of methodologies. But that all comes from your own experiences, your own needs, your cultural indoctrination, all of those issues. And as a character, they've got to have a clear methodology that they use because each of us does favor a methodology. We tend to use the same methodologies over and over again. So your character must have a visible motivation. Why are they acting like that? Second thing, how are they planning on achieving what they think will, third thing, satisfy what's driving them? But there's a fourth one. There's a fourth one that's a little hard to see. You know, whenever you're looking at anything and trying to understand it, it's always best to do it in fours. For example, you look at mass and energy and space and time. That describes the universe. Or you look at liquids, solids, gases, and plasma. Or you look at the strong forces of the universe, the weak forces, gravity and electromagnetism. No matter how you slice it and dice it, when you work in fours, the mind seems to best think you've covered all the bases. But there's usually one thing that seems out of place, like plasma doesn't seem like the other three, or gravity doesn't seem like the other three, or time doesn't seem like the other three. There's always one that seems a little out of place, a little out in left field. That's because it's the one we're actually standing on to make our evaluations. We're standing there saying, how can we observe these others? And we tend to stand on one, and it's hard seeing under our own feet. When we're writing characters, it's the same thing. And the one we tend to stand on structurally, that's means of evaluation. I mean, it's the one that we use to look at the other things. We tend not to look back at that means. And so basically, every character has a means of evaluation. For example, business partners. One might say, hey, we're doing great because we had 20 customers in today. And another one says, yeah, but they all left without making any sales. And the other one would say, okay, well, over the week we made some sales, but not enough to make a profit. Okay, so you got the accountant, you got the salesman, and you got the clerk. And they all have different means of evaluation about how they determine that, in fact, things are going well or things are going poorly. So to wrap all this up, there are 4 character dimensions. You need to have a 4-dimensional character, not a 3-dimensional character. The dimensions are of psychology, the psyche of the character. And like all human beings, we have 4 aspects to it. We have motivations, which are inequities, things out of balance that make us unsatisfied with the way things are, either to joyously try to achieve better or to miserably try to get rid of the stuff that's bad. And out of those motivations, we then have purposes that we think will satisfy that motivation. If only we have that, if only we can achieve that, then we will be satisfied. Then we have the methods that we use based on our experience, cultural indoctrination, personal preference, research. We figure it out, and we decide this is the way to go about it. And we usually get into a routine that kind of defines our personality, that we use the same kinds of methods over and over again to try and achieve things. We get in a habit. And then finally, the 4th and sometimes invisible character dimension is evaluation. You have to have the character stop and take stock of how they're doing, not just continue to try to achieve that purpose using that method and just keep on going and never look up and take a breath of air or smell the roses. They're going to have to sit down and see how they're doing because they may want to change their purpose, or they may want to change their method, or they may say, I'm motivated by this, but it's not a good time to act on it. All those things will come up in a well-argued story among the characters, but it never happens if they don't stop to evaluate. All right, so that's it for this session. I'm Melanie Ann Phillips, and you can get a lot more tips like this on my website at storymind.com.